Well, good morning, everybody. It is good to be with you this morning as we continue our look at the book of Revelation. Continuing our introductory comments this morning, we're going to be looking at some symbols and numbers and the idea of these things within the book of Revelation. As we get started, if you will, please join with me in a word of prayer. Our Lord and Father, we are grateful to you for this opportunity to come here and to study from your word. Lord, we're mindful of a number of our brethren who are not with us this morning for various reasons. Some are traveling, some are ill, and others are just struggling with life. And we pray, Father, that you'll be a comfort to them and help them through this difficult time and restore them back to us as you see fit. Lord, please be with us as we turn our attention to your word and help us to be open to what you have to say to us. In Christ's name, amen. All right, it goes without saying, I think, that the book of Revelation is full of symbols. All right, and we talked last week about some of the approaches and I find it interesting that we understand the use of symbolic language in our everyday life, and yet when people get to things like the book of Revelation, they seem to throw those ideas entirely out the window for no apparent reason. For example, if I was to tell you that it's raining cats and dogs, do you expect to actually walk out and see chihuahuas and tabby cats falling from the sky? Gary says he almost stepped in a poodle. But we don't, right? We understand that that's symbolic language, right? Okay, so we should understand that sometimes we say something that doesn't mean literally what it is. Okay, so we have to have that foundation, and we have to understand that that's a normal thing, right? The other thing that when we talk about symbols is we have to be careful that we don't over-examine a symbol. All right, I read a great example of this in one of the commentaries that I'm referring to, and he referenced a parade float, right? So let's talk about the Rose Parade, right? So in the Rose Parade, the float has to be covered in all the flowers, right? Yes. Okay, so you have a parade float, and let's say it's called, I don't know, the Revelation of John, right? Well, there has to be all those flowers, but how many people or how many commentators on TV during the Rose Parade sit there and analyze why they put that rose right there? Right? Each of those floats is made up of literally thousands of flowers, and yet we don't feel the need to examine the choice of putting one individual flower in each individual spot, right? We look at the float, we look at the overall theme, right? That's what we also have to do with the symbols, especially in a book like Revelation. When we try to push the issue too much and we try to overanalyze and we try to pin down some distinct significance to every vision, we're missing the point. And as we talked about previously, sometimes there's not a single individual meaning, right? We talked about how sometimes these symbols, as we talked about our approach to this book, sometimes these symbols are bigger and more general, right? They might be generally talking about the fight between good and evil, for example, not an actual incident, not a singular thing, right? And so given that, sometimes the image is more general than maybe we'd like it to be. All right, so that's our first two things. The third thing that I want to talk about first, and then we'll talk about some individual symbols here in a little bit, but sometimes symbols can change meaning. And sometimes they can change meaning within the same vision. Okay? One great example from the book of Revelation, and we'll talk more about this when we get there, is the woman. The woman gives birth to the child, which is representative of Jesus, but then later, as the woman is being chased, she represents the followers of the child. And yet another woman is used in the book of Revelation to represent the evils of Babylon. So we've got 3 women, but they don't all mean the same thing. And none of them represent actual women, like an actual person from history. Okay? So we need to understand that sometimes symbols can have different meanings, even within a smaller context. And so we can't assume that every time a symbol is used, it always means this. And we've even been talking about that from our study of the Old Testament, and that's also going to be very key as we talk about these things. All right, so let's talk about numerology. Now, there is different types of numerology. There is occultic numerology. That's not what we're talking about. And then there is just an awareness that, you know what? Numbers play a pretty important role in the Bible. Do they not? Okay. Now, when we think about the numbers in the Bible, something that's interesting about those numbers is that a majority of those numbers can be broken down into 3 numbers. The numbers 3, 4, and 10. Now, more numbers are used in the Bible, and there are numbers that are made from those numbers that hold heavy significance, but ultimately you can break it down to combinations of the numbers 3, 4, and 10. So let's talk about those 3 numbers first, and then we'll talk about some of the numbers made from those numbers. So the number 3. What do we know about the number 3? I'm sorry? The Godhead, days in the grave. It's a number that's generally associated with deity and the divine. Okay? It is usually a number that talks about God in some way. All right? Usually. I don't want to say that every single time, but the majority of the time it's talking about God, okay, in its biblical significance. What about the number 4? I know we've talked about this recently, especially in regards to the book of Ezekiel. When we think about the number 4, how many cardinal directions are there? North, east, south, and west. How many? 4. Okay, cool. Just making sure we're, following along here. We talk about the 4 corners of the earth, right? There were 4 angels in the book of Ezekiel. The 4 horsemen, right? It is also a number that's complete, but its completeness, generally speaking, in regards to the creation. Okay? And to some extent, even to humanity as more specific. Okay? Yes, the creation, but why was the earth created? For man. Okay? So sometimes it shifts from it's not necessarily just about the rocks and the trees and things, but again, it's the purpose of the earth. Okay, so then let's talk about 10. What do we think of when we think of 10? Completeness, right? Again, this one tends to be kind of more of a physical completeness, right? 10 fingers, 10 toes, right? Probably largely why most of our mathematical systems are based on the number 10. Well, because it's, easy to count for most of us, right? Okay, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. All right, So these are the three key numbers, and then we have to talk about some of the combinations of these three, and those combinations take from the significance of the original number and amplify it. All right, for example, our next number that we need to consider is 7. How do we get 7 from our three key numbers? 3 plus 4. So you've got the divine and you've got the complete creation, and so you've got divine completion or divine perfection. That's the number 7. Now when we talk about the number 7, we also have to keep in mind, what is half of 7? 3.5. 3.5. Now, if 7 is completeness, what would half of 7 most likely mean? Incomplete. And that's how it's largely used in the Bible. All right, so now another key number is 12. How do we get 12 from our key numbers? 3 times 4. Another number of completeness. This time dealing still with the deity, right? Because we still have 3, but 12 tends to be God's way of representing religious completeness, right? You had the 12 tribes, the 12 apostles, right? Indicators of the religious, so God's the divine interaction with humanity, with his creation. All right, so then we talk about then multiples. All right, so if those numbers combined amplify it, when we multiply those numbers, it amplifies even farther. So if we've got 10 and we multiply 10 times 10, we get 100, right? So that means an amplification of completeness. If we multiply it again and we get to 1,000, now we're really, really, really complete, right? Another number that comes up in the New Testament is 144. And specifically 144,000. Well, 144 is 12 times 12. So we've got religious completeness times religious completeness times human completeness 3 times. Wow. So is God literally meaning only 144,000 people are getting to heaven? No, he means that it's the complete number of the saved. Because that's how the numbers in the Bible and especially the book of Revelation work. When we have the multiples, it adds significance. All right, so there's two other numbers, I guess, really, that we need to talk about that play a smaller role. The number 1 usually signifies singleness, right? It's not used heavily in the book of Revelation, but we do see it other places in the Bible, so it's not a bad idea to talk about it, right? Because how many loves, faiths, and baptisms do we have? 1, right? It's not an insignificant number. So we've got the number 1. The other number is 6. Obviously, the number 6 plays a role in the book of Revelation, and so it is worth mentioning. Now, 6 is not quite to 7, right? So 7 is divine perfection. So 6 is representative of something that is powerful, but it's not divine. Does that make sense? So 4 is that completeness of humanity, the completeness of creation. 6 is bigger than that, right? When we think about 6, it does have a connotation to evil. We'll put it that way, to evil. Okay? So there is a power over the creation, but it is not divine. It's not as powerful as the divine, and it doesn't derive from the divine. It is 3 times 3, or 3 plus 3, but again, it's not 7. Okay, and that's the important factor there. And again, we're going to see a multiple of that, and that's going to heavily imply the evilness of the situation. All right. Any questions or comments?
Would it be incorrect to also say that 6 would be half of religious completeness?
Yeah, that's a good one. Half of 12, so incompleteness again, especially from a religious standpoint. Absolutely. Any other questions or comments about the numbers before we move on? I know that was a lot. If you're interested, I have a chart I can share.
Yeah, I understand it. I get it. I guess my question has always been, I understand the numerology in the Bible that is used. What I don't know is, why didn't the apostles or anybody else give these numerology math lessons to anybody else? I mean, is this just something we had to figure out mathematically, or, where did all of this math and numerology and times come from?
Well, a lot of it comes from the Old Testament. So a lot of these images and a lot of these numbers are used in the Old Testament, right? That we've mentioned the 12 apostles and all of those things. And so there's an amount where, as far as a New Testament standpoint, it may not have been spelled out because there was already an assumption that it was part of what you were going to learn as you studied the Old Testament. Because even Christians, even though they weren't bound by the Old Testament, they were still expected to know it and study it and learn from it.
I know the lesson in, when the question was asked, how many times should I forgive my brother?
Mm-hmm.
7 times. No, 7 times 7.
Mm-hmm.
So, and meaning a lot.
Yeah.
There's no end to it.
Exactly.
It's different. So I know that there is that kind of numerology in the Bible. It's like there's not a place you can go to that explains all of it.
And to some extent, God does expect us to, kind of look for patterns and just come to some of these things for ourselves. That being said, I don't think that the numbers are the strongest symbols. I think they're there to add emphasis, but they are not the symbol, if that makes sense. And so it's possible that that's also why, is because God doesn't want us to get bogged down on the number, right? There are religious groups that get obsessed with the numbers, right? But the numbers aren't really the key to the prophecy. It's just adding. It's like
the 144,000 in all of creation. They probably already met that number. So where are we?
Exactly.
So I know that symbol and that number doesn't represent an exact number of people that are going to heaven.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, like I said, if a symbol, if a vision, if something is, let's say, a steak, the numbers are the seasoning. You notice when they're not there, and if you don't know what they are, you put the wrong seasoning, you can definitely affect a steak, right? But at the same time, even if the number's not there, the steak's still a steak, right? And so that's I think the best way that I can say to look at the numbers is, again, we need to be aware, and especially if you're eating a good meal and wow, there's just this flavor, you want to know what it is, right?
Numbers play a big part in humanity. Numbers are involved in everything.
Mm-hmm.
Months, days, birth dates. Mathematicians is a big thing. I'm no mathematician, but mathematicians can throw numbers to almost anything and however it is built and designed. And So it's a big part. You also heard of gematria. Gematria is a big thing as far as numbers to words. And it's something that's being thrown around a lot lately. And how words have meaning, or numbers have meaning to a lot of things.
They do. There's a lot of things that are claimed to be numerology as far as the religious, but I don't believe in most of it, to be honest, because I don't see the significance that a lot of the people place on these things. Because, like most things, you can make something fit if you really, really want to. But again, like I said, the numbers they're there. And it is important that we have a basic understanding of their significance. But again, and absolutely numbers are important as far as humanity is concerned. You know, math is everywhere, and largely math is patterns, right? And that's, again, another one of those things is we're looking at patterns. We're looking at patterns from the Old Testament that are then reused here in the book of Revelation, and one of those patterns is numbers. And so, that's really the reason that we're mentioning this is, again, I don't want to put too much emphasis on numbers, but I think it'd be a mistake to pretend as though the numbers didn't matter. And so now let's talk about what I do think is very important, and those are symbols from the Old Testament that we're going to see in the book of Revelation. Now, this isn't a complete list. This is not a complete list. These are key symbols that I believe we need to have an understanding of. Now, that being said, the book of Revelation only works if you have an understanding of the Old Testament, kind of like the book of Hebrews. Okay? And we often, I think, get the wrong idea from books like Galatians and others, or people draw the wrong conclusions, is maybe a better way to put that. That to some people, the Old Testament has no value for the Christian because we're not under the old law. But God was still God, right?
Well, it says it's a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ.
It is a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ, exactly. Mm-hmm. And without the Old Testament, of course, how would we know how the earth was created? We know that God was involved, right? We can look at different books in the New Testament that talk about Jesus being involved in creation, but as far as the actual creation, we don't have a detailed description in the New Testament, right? So we have to go to the Old Testament. And again, if we're going, and the second we acknowledge the necessity of the Old Testament, we have to acknowledge the necessity of the entire Old Testament, by the way. We can't just say that Genesis chapters 1 and 2 and 3 are important and the rest can be left aside. How do we even, I don't even know how somebody begins to make that kind of mental jump, but that doesn't make any sense, right? At the very least, the entirety of the book of Genesis has to be important, not just the first couple of chapters. And the same thing goes then with, well, okay, the rest of the books of Moses. But then Jesus says, well, everything that's written about me in the law and the prophets and the Psalms. Well, if Jesus himself says that we need to understand the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, we need to understand the Old Testament. All right, so let's talk about some symbols. Now, I'm gonna give you the symbol, and I'm gonna give you a reference. We're not gonna, for the sake of time, we're not gonna look at every single one of these. But if there's a reference that you've never heard of, say so. Because if there's enough people that haven't heard of it, it might be worth taking a deeper look at it, especially when we come to that section. And so, things I need to know, right? All right, so these are semi-chronological. Semi-chronological. All right? So, we've got the tree of life. These are not going to be necessarily chronological to the book of Revelation, but chronological in the Old Testament. The tree of life is mentioned in chapters 2 and 3 of the book of Genesis, and it plays a big role in the book of Revelation. We've got the rainbow, also plays a large role. Genesis chapter 9. The 12 tribes, Genesis chapter 35. And again, I'm kind of cherry picking chapters. Obviously, like for example, the 12 tribes are mentioned a lot of other places, but their first mention of the 12 brothers is Genesis chapter 35, or beginning in Genesis chapter 35. All right, then you've got Egypt. And I'm just going to put the book of Exodus for that one. All right, because the book, as far as Egypt is concerned, there's a few different ones. There's the idea of captivity, there's the plagues, there's the Exodus itself, right? The wilderness wanderings and things. All of those symbols make their way in one way or another into the book of Revelation. And so just understand the book of Exodus and its relation to the land of Egypt. Now, one of those that comes out of that is important enough to mention specifically on its own is the Passover lamb, Exodus chapter 12. The tabernacle. And you could put in parentheses, I guess, the temple. But remember, the temple was later, and the temple was largely David's idea. Now, God accepted it, God ordained it, but God was happy with and fine with the tabernacle. God never commanded the building of the temple. And so, the tabernacle is described in Exodus chapters 25 through 30. Both its layout, its construction materials, all of that. And some of those symbols. And it's important that we understand that. Now, those are some of the hardest chapters of the book of Exodus, okay? I'm not going to lie to you. They are tough reading because it's just, I want this carved into this and I want this. And there's a lot of detail. But again, when God talks about these things in regards to the place that he's going to establish his throne, it's probably kind of important, right? But also some of those images make their way into our other writings. If we don't understand, for example, the veil of division, we don't understand the significance of when the veil is torn at Jesus' death, right? So again, also from the tabernacle, you've got things like the lampstands, the incense, the holy place, the Holy of Holies. Again, these are all parts and pieces that make their way into this book. And so just a general good understanding of the tabernacle is going to help us. All right, so then we also have the book of life. The book of life is mentioned in Exodus chapter 32 and also Malachi chapter 3. Now I'm giving you chapters, not specific verses, because you need to look at contexts. And so there's more than just maybe the single verse where it says the phrase book of life. But if you want to narrow it down, you can also do a Google search for book of life in the Bible, and it'll tell you all the individual verses. It's pretty simple to find. Okay, next, Megiddo. Megiddo. You probably are more familiar with the Battle of Megiddo, or Har Megiddo, Armageddon. Okay? But Megiddo is mentioned in Judges chapter 5, where there was a real-life battle. The city of Jerusalem is obviously very important, and it is chosen by God in 2 Samuel chapter 5. And so Jerusalem being God's chosen city adds some significance, and it's why often in the book of Revelation we're going to see references to the city or even the New Jerusalem, because God himself applied a significance to that city. The Davidic kingdom, or David as the king, is also very key, right? And that is 2 Samuel chapter 7. 2 Samuel chapter 7. Elijah the prophet and his work in 1 Kings. I picked 1 Kings chapter 17 as kind of the beginning of his work. But Elijah is also a key symbol, right? In the Bible in general, in the New Testament, and in the book of Revelation. And Jezebel. Also from 1 Kings chapter 16. By the way, 1 Kings chapter 17 is Elijah's battle with the priests of Baal or Baal. All right, so Jezebel, 1 Kings chapter 16. All right, so any of those symbols or things that we need to maybe take a little bit closer look at?
Garrett, I was wondering, in my recollection of studying David,
Mm-hmm.
was he the one that wanted to build the temple and God had a problem with that?
Yes. David wanted to build the temple, but God said David had too much blood on his hands from being a warrior. And so he said, he basically told David, I love your heart for wanting to build me a temple, but I'm going to leave that to your son. I'm going to leave that to a man of peace in a time of peace. And so now that being said, you could still make the argument that David built the temple, because by the time Solomon took the throne, the Bible tells us in the book of 2 Samuel that David had amassed most, if not all, of the necessary materials to build the temple, and basically had them sitting around waiting, because God never told David, don't get wood, don't get stone, don't get all of these things. He just said David couldn't be the one overseeing the construction. And so that when Solomon began his reign and his construction of the temple, basically everything was already sitting there. All he had to do was hire the craftsmen and finish it. Okay, so now we've got some symbols and some incidences and even people. So let's talk about some key prophecies. These are going to be sometimes general prophecies. They're going to sometimes be visions, but things that come up, especially from the Old Testament, in regards to the New. Oh, and the first of these kind of ties back to key symbols, but Babylon is mainly symbolic in books like Ezekiel, and we don't really have a lot of post-captivity books, so it makes it hard to pick out that. But the fall of Babylon, as depicted in Isaiah chapter 13, obviously becomes key. And historically, we also know that while Egypt was often referred to by God in the Old Testament, that post-Babylonian captivity, Egypt was often replaced in the people's minds with Babylon. Okay? As far as a symbol of captivity. Okay, so the fall of Babylon, Isaiah chapter 13. New heavens and new earth, Isaiah 65 and 66. Locusts, Joel chapter 2. The four creatures, Ezekiel chapters 1 and 10. We're going to see similarities. The eating of the book, Ezekiel chapters 2 and 3. I think you'll see why I've chosen to do the book of Ezekiel, at least in large part, before we get here. Gog and Magog, Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. The water of life, Ezekiel chapter 47. The city, Ezekiel chapter 48. Beasts. And what I mean by that are beasts that, for example, rise up out of the ground or rise up out of the water, or beasts that have terrible and terrifying attributes. Well, that's not just the book of Revelation. We see that in the book of Daniel, right? Especially Daniel chapter 7. Books being called to be opened, also from Daniel chapter 7. The measuring rod. This one comes from Ezekiel 40, but also Zechariah 2. God uses that one in heavy significance twice in the Old Testament. And then also from the book of Zechariah, the idea of having two witnesses, or two people that rise to power for God. All right. So were there any of those key prophecies that that we need to talk about a little bit more? Or maybe is there one that you think I missed or you have questions about? All right, so I would recommend, we've already looked over Isaiah in large part. We're still continuing in the book of Ezekiel. The other book that I would recommend that you look at as part of your study for the book of Revelation would, of course, be the book of Zechariah. It's a very key book especially in the minor prophets, but there are a lot of prophecies in the book of Zechariah about the Messiah and other things as well. So it would definitely be worth your time to at least maybe refamiliarize yourself by reading through Zechariah as part of our study of the book of Revelation. Excuse me. All right. Any other questions or comments before we move on? All right. So there are some other key symbols that we're going to see used here in the book, and these are more of a historical significance. When I say historical, I mean obviously Old Testament is historical, but these are not biblically historical, and yet we need to understand them because they're significant. There are some symbols of the city of Rome. Anybody know the legend of the founding of Rome? Romulus and Remus, two twin brothers who supposedly founded the city. How many mountains surround the city of Rome? 7. That's also important. Okay? She's sometimes described as a city set on 7 hills. So those are significant things that were very important, especially to the Romans in their understanding of the world. Okay? We also have some symbols taken from the idea of the Caesars. Okay? The Caesars themselves claimed deity. That began really with Julius Caesar, although there is some historical question as to how much power Julius himself wielded. The fact that he was essentially the first one to bring it all together and essentially lay the groundwork for what we would later know as Rome is important. And in fact, Julius was the first of the Caesars to be deified. There were actually temples built to his name and things after his death, even though he was murdered by his own people. Funny how we do that sometimes, right? Then, of course, we have to understand the later persecutions. All right? So, Rome kind of did its own thing, but then by the time we get to the reign of Nero and then later Domitian, Rome is beginning to realize that these Christian people are kind of a thing. Okay? And so we begin to see some of that persecution. Now, especially when we look at the letters in chapters 2 and 3, Jesus through John is going to talk about further persecution. When we get into the 2nd and 3rd centuries of Rome, you've got men like Diocletian and Vespasian and others who literally made it their goal in life to kill every Christian and burn every copy of the Bible that they could get their hands on. They felt that that was their life's work. They didn't succeed, okay, obviously, right? But it was the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and I think maybe even it's worth taking a second and remembering that 1st century means 0. I think it's good to think of maybe the dates in 3 digits, even when there isn't the 0 at the front, right? So if we're talking about, for example, the destruction of Jerusalem, it's the 1st century, so it's 070. 2nd century is actually the 100s. That gets confusing for me sometimes. I just want to make sure everybody is remembering these things as I talk about 2nd and 3rd centuries. I mean 100s and 200s. And so it's probably that time and that type of persecution that John largely has in mind when we look at this book from a historical standpoint. And we see these things played out heavily right up until right around 300, when Constantine declares Christianity the official religion of Rome. And then that's going to bring in a whole nother layer of issues, right? Let's talk just a minute. We've only got a couple minutes, and I really don't, this isn't political, okay? But when we talk about the separation of church and state from an American standpoint, we need to make sure that we understand it from its original intent, which was keeping the government out of our churches. Because you know what happened when Constantine declared declared Christianity the official religion of Rome? Constantine and other emperors started interfering in the way the church was run. Anybody know why it's called Roman Catholicism? Because it shares as much with the Roman government hierarchy as it does with anything else. The idea of having a pope equals Caesar. You've got cardinals and bishops and things, and these are the different layers of hierarchy, like governors and prefects and all of these types of things that we see in the New Testament. And so we need to understand that these types of things kind of integrated because of what happened in 300. And that ultimately then kind of also influenced the rise of those types of things. I don't necessarily think that that's the heaviest part of what John really had in mind when he's writing these things, but it is kind of important that we understand these things of the government getting involved in the church and how that can be detrimental, because that is actually a theme to this book. We'll talk about that as we get there. All right, any other questions or comments before we close this morning?
That was good with the forefathers too.
What's that?
That was good with the forefathers when they developed the Constitution.
Yes. And we have to understand that America was founded by people who were fleeing from places like England and France and other places where a state-run religion was mandatory. Whether you believed what they believed or not, in England, you have to be a part of the Church of England. In France, it's largely been Roman Catholicism. And that changes other places. Again, if there's a state church, there's a level of forced compliance. And America was founded against that idea, but it's not a wholly American idea, as we're going to see. All right, there are warnings about letting the government get involved in the church in the book of Revelation.
That's why when prayer in school comes up, I'm real hesitant, because whose prayer? The government sanctioned prayer? If you're going to give one prayer that will be acceptable to everyone, it really doesn't.
Well, that's a whole nother discussion, and that definitely gets into politics, which we're not going to do this morning. But again, just kind of be aware of these things. So, all right. So, Lord willing, next week we'll kind of wrap all of this up with a bow as far as an introduction goes, and we will begin John's introduction, which is the first chapter of the book of Revelation. Lord willing. All right. Thank you.